Today we are taking a journey, not into theory or future technology, but deep into the history of medical investigation.
And our sources today are, they're dense, they're terrifying, and frankly, they're completely unique.
We're looking at the inaugural dissertation of a medical student in 1804 who decided the only way to test his hypothesis about a lethal disease was to subject himself to a series of escalating, grotesque self-experiments.
We are talking about Stubbins Ffirth, a man whose ambition and just utter conviction led him to risk everything, not just his reputation, but his life.
And he did this by ingesting and inoculating himself with the very substance that characterized the final fatal stages of yellow fever.
The black vomit.
Our mission is to use this historical drama to illustrate how scientific progress often navigates this labyrinth of plausible errors before it stumbles upon the brutal truth.
We're going to unpack Ffirth's 1804 treatise, a treatise on malignant fever, with an attempt to prove its non-contagious nature.
And we're going to contrast his accidental survival with the deliberate, fatal sacrifice made nearly a century later that finally unlocked the secrets of yellow fever transmission.
Yeah, we have the benefit of hindsight in modern virology, which is really the key here. It allows us to analyze Ffirth's data, his detailed experiments on animals and himself, and show you exactly why he was technically wrong in his conclusion, yet still survived this ordeal.
So the story begins where the disease hit hardest.
In the early capital of the United States. To really understand the mindset of Stubbins Ffirth in 1804, you first have to understand the terror that Philadelphia had endured a decade earlier, and it kept coming back in cycles.
Right. We're talking about the yellow fever epidemics. And the big one, the one that scarred the city's psyche, was the outbreak of 1793.
This was the heart of the new nation. Philadelphia was the bustling center of commerce, government, intellectual life.
And it was a dense port city, which is key. So when the disease hit, it didn't just cause illness, it caused a complete social and economic collapse.
It really did. Ffirth himself, in his treatise, he's writing to the inhabitants of Philadelphia. And his language is so vivid, you can feel the trauma.
What does he say?
He describes those who had felt, who have seen, and who have trembled at the dire progress of a malignant epidemic, spreading its baneful influence, its rapid progress, and its march characterized by disorder, dismay, desolation, and death.
Wow. So this isn't just a disease. He's describing it as a psychological weapon.
It absolutely was. And the fear itself, he argued, accelerated the disease's malignancy.
And the physical symptoms.
Yeah.
They gave the disease its name and its legend.
Exactly. The victims became visibly jaundiced, this ghastly yellow hue from liver failure.
That's where we get the name yellow fever. And actually, the name of the viral genus, flavivirus, comes from the Latin word for yellow, flavus.
But the truly defining, horrifying symptom, the one that drove all of Ffirth's work, was what the Spanish called the vomito prieto.
The black vomit.
The black vomit. You have to picture this. The patient is in the final stages of organ failure. They're hemorrhaging internally, and they eject this dark, thick, viscid mucus mixed with blood. It was often described as resembling strong coffee grounds.
And from a medical perspective, that is the material focus of the contagion debate at the time. If the disease is contagious, it's a perfectly reasonable assumption for 19th century doctors to think that this visible, undeniable product of the disease is the thing that transmits it.
Absolutely. The entire medical world was fundamentally split on this. The debate boiled down to two camps.
Okay, what were they?
On one side, you had the contagionists. They believed the disease was imported by foreign vessels, sailors, cargo, materials arriving at the busy port. And for them, the solution was simple, if brutal.
Quarantine.
Strict quarantine laws. Shut down the ports, protect the city by exclusion, even if it destroyed commerce.
And the other side.
The other side, which Ffirth enthusiastically joined, was the domestic camp. They argued that the disease arose from local causes. It was endemic to the environment of Philadelphia itself.
Which means quarantine laws were not only useless.
But they destroyed the economy for no reason at all. They believed the real solution was public sanitation, clean up the city.
So Ffirth is writing his thesis to champion this domestic cause. He's arguing passionately against foreign importation.
He is. He believed the problem lay in the city's environmental state. So if he could prove that direct contact with the sick, or their secretions, did not spread the disease, he could invalidate the entire importation theory.
And that belief system leads him directly to the reigning pathological theory at the time.
Miasma.
Right. Let's unpack miasma, because for anyone listening, you have to understand this wasn't just some superstitious idea about bad smells. It was a rigorous, though flawed, scientific hypothesis based on observation.
It absolutely was. Miasma theory argued that malignant fever was generated locally from what they call the inflammatory constitution of the atmosphere.
I love that phrase.
It required this trifecta of conditions: filth, animal and vegetable putrefaction, and morbid exhalations rising into the air. This noxious fog.
And Ffirth observed correctly that the disease was most prevalent in hot, humid, and stagnant air,
Yeah.
especially during specific wind patterns. He concluded these conditions generated the morbid miasma.
He was a good observer.
He was an excellent observer. And this is where, as a skeptic, my methodology brain kicks in. If we look at Ffirth's observations through the lens of modern virology, what we see is a tragic near miss.
Go on.
He was observing the right ecological factors, but drawing the completely wrong mechanistic conclusion.
Explain that synthesis for us.
Okay. Yellow fever is caused by the yellow fever virus, a flavivirus. We now know it's transmitted solely by the bite of an infected mosquito, primarily the Aedes aegypti.
Right, the mosquito.
Now, where does Aedes aegypti thrive? This is the crucial part. It is a highly domesticated mosquito. It doesn't breed in big swamps or natural lakes. It breeds in small, stagnant water containers right next to where people live.
Cisterns, broken pottery, abandoned barrels.
Exactly. Pools of water trapped by poor drainage, all the things you'd find in a dirty 18th century port city.
Which
means the very conditions Ffirth cited: filth, putrefaction, hot, humid, stagnant air, are the exact ecological prerequisites for a massive population bloom of the Aedes aegypti vector.
Oh, wow.
They were looking at the consequences of poor sanitation and high heat, and they concluded that the transmission mechanism was the air itself, the morbid exhalations.
They mistook the environment that bred the agent, the vector, for the agent itself. They were observing the ecological signature of the mosquito, but they completely missed the biological agent flying out of those dirty water containers.
It's a spectacular observational error. Ffirth saw the filth, he saw the death, and he correctly deduced the source was domestic. But because he was so convinced it was airborne and non-contagious via direct contact, he focused his entire scientific inquiry on proving one thing:
that the physical discharge of the sick, the black vomit, was, in his words, mild, inert, and harmless.
And that belief that the contagion was a myth was powerful enough to compel a young man to embark on one of the most reckless, yet meticulously documented self-experimentation campaigns in all of medical history. So our protagonist, Stubbins F., was a medical student and a house surgeon at the Philadelphia dispensary. In 1804, he presents his inaugural dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a paper. This was his professional declaration.
He was throwing down a gauntlet. I mean, he admits in the text that he was initially a believer in the contagion and importation of it. But his subsequent facts and experiments, he says, convinced him that yellow fever never was, and unless the laws of nature should change, never will be a contagious disease.
The confidence in that statement, unless the laws of nature should change, he's challenging the very foundation of what people understood.
And he had powerful backers. The work was dedicated to a Dr. Caspar Wistar, a huge figure in Philadelphia medicine at the time. Ffirth wasn't just doing some lab project in a basement. He was actively attempting to reshape public health policy.
Because if he was right, the quarantine laws, which absolutely crippled commerce, could be abolished. The stakes were monumental.
So his central thesis required a demonstration. He had to prove that the defining product of the disease, the black vomit, could not communicate the disease to a healthy host.
And he started rationally enough, with animal trials.
Right. Before he subjected himself to this horrifying material, he had to see if it worked on, as he saw them, lesser beings.
Okay, let's go through the initial protocol. Experiment I.
Experiment I involved a small dog. Ffirth confined the dog, and for 3 days, he fed it bread soaked in fresh black vomit.
How did the dog react to that?
Well, Ffirth noted that the dog quickly became accustomed to the taste and eventually had to be tricked into eating it. But the result, critically, was that the dog remained perfectly healthy. He noted no other effect.
Okay, one data point. So next was experiment 2.
A cat. A small cat was fed 3 ounces of the black vomit daily for 5 days.
And the result?
Same thing. The cat remained perfectly healthy and showed no signs of disease. The ingestion route, it seemed, was benign.
Now, if you are a 19th century pathologist, and you're convinced that this stuff is just a morbid secretion from the arteries of the stomach, a toxic byproduct, not a carrier, These feeding trials are lining up perfectly with your hypothesis.
Exactly. The ingestion route failed to transmit the malignant fever, but Ffirth was diligent. He knew that the mode of introduction matters.
Right. A skeptic would immediately argue digestion is one thing, but what about direct introduction into the systemic circulation?
And this is where we reach the first, just profound psychological and methodological moment in his research, Experiment 4.
The one experiment that, when you view it with modern eyes, should have stopped him completely.
Ffirth took 1 ounce of black vomit and he injected it directly into the jugular vein of a dog, intravenously.
So he bypassed the digestive system entirely and put the material straight into the bloodstream.
Straight in.
And the result was
Immediate and catastrophic. Ffirth writes that the dog immediately showed signs of great uneasiness. It purged violently. It became convulsed and expired in 10 minutes in great agony.
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay, pause right there. As you said, 10 minutes is not the timeline of yellow fever. The incubation period is days, followed by a multi-day course. 10 minutes is acute poisoning.
It's toxicity, not infection.
So how does the aspiring scientist, Stubbins Ffirth, look at a convulsing, instantly dying dog and continue with his hypothesis that the material is benign? What on earth was he thinking?
Well, I think he was engaging in a kind of intellectual compartmentalization. His primary mission was to prove the material did not cause the malignant fever, the full multi-stage disease he was studying.
Okay.
The dog died of rapid, acute poisoning. Ffirth actually theorized that the black vomit was an altered secretion that caused great inflammatory action, similar to corrosive poisons like arsenic or opium. So in his mind, the death confirmed the toxicity of the fluid.
But he dismissed it as evidence for contagion because it didn't produce the delayed specific symptoms of the fever.
That's it, exactly. He successfully proved the vomit was lethal if injected. But since it didn't cause yellow fever in the way he understood it, he believed he had actually strengthened his case for its non-contagious nature.
That is such a profound trap of the era. They didn't understand viruses, they didn't understand vectors, and they confused immediate toxicity with delayed contagion.
His conviction that yellow fever required a specific atmospheric predisposition was so powerful that he could just rationalize away the agonizing death of an injected dog.
So if the dog died from poison and not from the fever, the next logical step, at least in Ffirth's mind, was to prove that a healthy human body, unlike a dog's, could resist its less direct introduction.
And that led him straight to his own body.
The desire for scientific credit, the zeal to overturn prevailing assumptions, the huge political stakes of the quarantine debate.
All of these factors combined to convince Stubbins Ffirth that the only pure data set left was his own resilience. So before we get into the details of the self-experiments, we need to reiterate the horror of the source material here. Ffirth was not working with some clean, laboratory-purified substance.
No, this was raw hemorrhagic discharge from dying patients.
And he described it in his treatise. He said the black vomit was a thick, tough, and viscid mucus is ejected, resembling strong coffee grounds, often mixed with blood, salts, and having this peculiar, almost sickly sweet odor.
And he really treated it like a forensic scientist of his time. I mean, he meticulously cataloged its properties. He ran chemical analyses with acids and alcohol. He was trying to isolate the toxic component he believed was causing that inflammatory action.
He had to convince himself it was merely a corrosive substance, a pathological waste product, not a carrier of a living transmissible agent.
And so, armed with this conviction, he was committed to testing every single portal of entry for this morbid material into his own body. He started with the most basic barrier: the skin.
Experiment 1, the incision. This was the deliberate breach of the skin barrier, seeking to mimic what they assumed happened with contagious diseases like smallpox if it was introduced via a cut.
How did he do it?
On October 4th, 1802, Ffirth made an incision in his left arm and introduced some fresh black vomit.
And the result?
He reports only a slight degree of inflammation and that the wound healed very readily.
But Stubbins Ffirth was not a man who accepted a single data point.
Not at all. 4 days later, Experiment 7, he escalates the risk significantly. He makes a considerable incision in his right arm, introduces 5 drops of the black vomit, covers it, and leaves it for 2 days.
Yeah.
Nothing. No ill effect, no inflammation, no pus.
And this is the part that speaks to his fanaticism.
It really is. Experiment 8. He writes that he repeated this procedure 20 times on various parts of my body and with precisely the same result during 2 successive epidemics.
20 times?
20 separate incisions, all inoculated with fluid from dying patients. This speaks to a level of dedication that is, it's rarely seen.
Okay, wait, I need to interrupt here with the skeptic scientist analysis. 20 times. Why did this fail? Ffirth believed he had proven non-contagion. We know he was wrong. Why didn't he contract yellow fever from direct inoculation?
Well, what's the modern explanation?
It all comes down to the required mechanism of viral entry. Yellow fever virus is transmitted subcutaneously by the bite of an infected Aedes aegypti. The mosquito's saliva is a cocktail of bioactive compounds, vasodilators, anticoagulants, that facilitate the delivery of the virus directly into the dermal layer.
So it's not just a poke.
It's a highly sophisticated biological injection. It gets the virus quickly into the lymphatic system and then the bloodstream. Simple cuts or scrapes, even deliberate incisions made with a scalpel and then smeared with black vomit are not the same thing.
But the delivery system is missing.
The delivery system is everything. Even if the black vomit contained viral particles, and that's a very big if that we'll come back to, the virus needs that efficient entry route. Ffirth was just rubbing fluid into shallow cuts. The skin's own immune response, the lack of depth, the absence of the mosquito's saliva, it meant the virus just couldn't establish a systemic infection. He was testing for a surface contagion, not a biological injection.
So, undeterred by the failure of external transmission, Ffirth then moved to the most sensitive external membranes he could find.
I think I know where this is going.
Experiment IX, the eye drop. Ffirth took 2 drops of fresh black vomit and put them directly into his right eye.
Ugh, that is just deeply unsettling. What did he report?
He reported feeling a little uneasy for about a minute, but again, no pain or inflammation, no effect whatsoever.
And for him, this would have been huge. A major mucous membrane, a known entry point for many pathogens, failed to transmit the disease.
It would have massively strengthened his conviction. If a highly contagious agent could breach the barrier of the eye, it would have. His conclusion, based on his flawed miasma theory, was totally sound to him. The disease wasn't contagious via contact.
But he still had to address the miasma itself, the air. If the disease wasn't contagious by fluid contact, maybe it was spread by the exhalations, the vapor of the toxic matter that permeated that inflammatory constitution of the atmosphere.
Which brings us to experiment 3, the vomit sauna.
This is the act of medical self-flagellation that is the hardest to rationalize.
He started small, experiment X. He took 3 ounces of recent black vomit, put it into a hot iron skillet, heated it until the fluid evaporated, and then he just inhaled the resulting steam frequently. He reported no unpleasant sensation.
But the escalation proves his commitment. He moved to experimental eye.
He did. He heated a small stove room to a sweltering 100 degrees Fahrenheit. He placed 6 ounces of black vomit on the stove to evaporate for 2 hours, and he stayed in that sealed, hot room, breathing the concentrated vapor of hemorrhagic material.
Did he report any effects from that?
He did. He noted symptoms. He felt pain in his head and nausea.
Uh-huh. So he got a result.
But he dismissed it entirely. He attributed the discomfort evidently to the great heat of the room and not from the black vomit.
That is a stunning example of confirmation bias protecting the hypothesis. He was so convinced that the air was the vector, yet when his own controlled experiment produced symptoms, he attributed them to the heat, not the substance he was actually testing.
It just shows how profoundly the miasma theory blinded him to his own internal evidence.
So, having ruled out air and skin, Ffirth went to the final, most reckless stage.
Internal consumption.
Experiment 4, the drink. This is the legacy moment. This is what he's known for.
He started by swallowing pills made from an extract of the vomit, but he escalated quickly to the raw material.
What does he describe?
He describes taking half an ounce of the black vomit immediately after it was ejected from a patient and drinking it, diluted with a little water.
My God. And his observations.
He documented the taste as very slightly acid. He reported feeling no mental anxiety or nausea. He even took his own pulse, noting it remained normal at 76 beats a minute. Moderately strong and full.
And in a final act of just reckless confidence, he repeats this.
He does. He writes that he repeated the internal consumption, sometimes taking up to 2 ounces, drinking it at length without dilution during 2 successive epidemics. He survived it all, declaring his thesis proven: the fluid was inert and harmless.
His final conclusion was that any perceived danger from the fluid was only, and I'm quoting here, from the association of ideas and the influence of the mind on the stomach.
Incredible.
Okay, this is the final, most important scientific interruption. How did Stubbins Ffirth survive ingesting 2 ounces of liquid potentially containing a highly virulent virus? It is the most impressive yet entirely accidental biological shield in his favor.
He was testing a system that evolution had designed precisely to stop infectious agents from entering via the alimentary canal.
Right. The yellow fever virus, like many viruses, relies on a very delicate protein structure to function. The human stomach contains gastric acid, primarily hydrochloric acid. It creates an intensely acidic environment. We're talking a pH of 1.5 to 3.5.
To put that in context for you, battery acid is typically a pH of 1.
So gastric acid is powerful enough to break down tissue and, more importantly, neutralize most pathogens, including the delicate structure of a flavivirus.
He was literally giving the virus an acid bath.
He was testing a viral agent via a route, the digestive system, that is robustly fortified against it. The gastric acid would have denatured the proteins and destroyed the vast majority of the YFE particles before they could ever pass through the gastrointestinal tract and enter the bloodstream.
So his survival wasn't proof that yellow fever was non-contagious?
It was proof that his stomach worked exceptionally well as a chemical defense system. He was testing a vector-borne illness using the methodology appropriate for a food-borne illness or direct contact contagion. The combination of the body's natural defenses and the specific requirements of the virus transmission pathway meant Ffirth's survival was, biologically speaking, predetermined, regardless of his bravery.
So we've established that Stubbins Ffirth survived his just astonishing self-experiments due to the simple mechanics of human biology. Gastric acid, the skin barrier, and the specific requirement for subcutaneous injection by a vector.
But there is a final, crucial technicality that protected Ffirth, and it relates directly to the timing of the viral life cycle. This, for me, is the real aha moment of this whole deep dive.
This requires us to look at the biphasic course of yellow fever infection, as we know it today.
Right. Phase 1 is the period of infection. This is typically 3 to 6 days after the mosquito bite.
Right.
During this time, the virus is circulating freely in the blood and other bodily secretions. This is the viremia stage.
The time when the patient is actually infectious to a mosquito that bites them.
Exactly. If Ffirth had consumed blood or fluids from a patient in this early stage, the viral load would have been at its absolute highest, though he still would have faced that stomach acid barrier.
But he wasn't interested in the early stage. He was fixated on the visible signature symptom,
The black vomit.
which defines the period of intoxication, the severe final stage. This stage occurs about 7 to 10 days after the onset of symptoms. It involves multi-organ failure, hemorrhage. It's the end game.
And here's the scientific twist. Modern research confirms that by the time a patient is exhibiting the fatal symptoms of black vomit, viremia is usually absent.
Wow, really?
The patient's immune system has often cleared the virus from the circulation by that point, or the patient is simply so far gone into organ failure that the virus is no longer actively circulating at transmissible levels.
So Ffirth survived because he was testing fluid ejected from patients at death's door beyond the point of peak infectiousness.
Yes. He was testing the pathological consequence of the disease, not the viral agent. His survival was a profound accident of viral pathogenesis timing.
So his theory was wrong, his method was wrong for a vector-borne illness, and the timing of the disease cycle itself saved his life.
And it allowed him to publish this deeply flawed, yet scientifically persuasive thesis that actually set public health policy back for decades by reinforcing the non-contagionist viewpoint.
It wasn't until nearly a century later that the true fatal price of this particular scientific discovery was paid. And for that, we have to move from Philadelphia in 1804 to Cuba in 1900.
During the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. Army was just being crippled by yellow fever.
Enter the U.S. Army Yellow Fever Board, led by Major Walter Reed. They were tasked with finally figuring out the cause. And the focus of this board was largely on the theories of a Cuban physician, Carlos Finley.
Finley, as early as 1881, had correctly hypothesized that mosquitoes transmitted the disease, but it was just a hypothesis.
Exactly. A hypothesis is one thing, confirmation is another, especially when it goes against decades of entrenched scientific belief in things like miasma. The man who confirmed Finley's hypothesis and provided the ultimate tragic proof was an American physician on the board named Jesse Lazear.
And Lazear understood that the only way to prove a vector-borne illness was to isolate the vector. He was using Aedes aegypti larvae provided by Finlay's own lab. He started with volunteers, but then he decided to eliminate all possible doubt.
Unlike Ffirth, whose self-experimentation was born of this conviction against contagion, Lazear's was a calculated, intentional risk to prove contagion via the vector.
He had the right theory, and he selected the right instrument.
The mosquito itself. Lazear deliberately allowed an infected mosquito to bite him to study the disease course firsthand.
He knew what he was doing. Just before the bite, in September 1900, he wrote to his wife, "I rather think I am on the track of the real germ." He was closing in on the truth that Ffirth had completely missed.
And the tragic outcome confirmed the lethal truth. Lazear contracted yellow fever, and he died 17 days later. He was 34 years old.
But his death confirmed it. The Aedes aegypti was the transmission route.
And this contrast between Ffirth and Lazear, it just defines this entire story. Ffirth, armed with the wrong miasma theory, survives his grotesque exposure due to a combination of luck, timing, and stomach acid.
And Lazear, armed with the correct vector theory, takes one calculated bite and dies, providing the certainty needed to start the eradication campaigns that would eventually allow monumental projects like the Panama Canal to even be completed.
And that certainty didn't come without its own complications. Lazear's deliberate self-experiment was initially covered up. It was attributed to an accidental bite, possibly for family insurance reasons, or to avoid official censure for taking such a risk.
It wasn't until 1947, when his notebook is found, that the full extent of his heroic, fatal choice was revealed.
So Ffirth pursued the truth through what he called the mazy labyrinth of error, and he survived, but his conclusion was ultimately a setback for science.
And Lazear cut straight to the truth, with his own life as the currency. It just crystallizes the nonlinearity of scientific progress. One man's sheer audacity, based on an accurate observation of the environment, but a flawed theory of mechanism, led to a conclusion that was only valid because his body was fighting the wrong battle at the wrong time.
While the other man's sacrifice, based on the right mechanism, fundamentally changed global public health forever.
So what does this extraordinary visceral piece of medical history mean for you today, the learner listening to this?
Well, for one, it reinforces that scientific rigor is only as good as the underlying hypothesis about the mode of transmission. Ffirth was rigorous within the framework of miasma and direct contagion, but the whole framework was based on a fundamental misidentification of the agent and its mechanism.
And we have to remember that yellow fever isn't just some historical trivia. Despite the massive public health campaigns and the widespread use of vaccines, all thanks to Lazear's discovery, yellow fever remains a re-emerging threat.
That's right. The virus cycles in what we call the sylvatic or jungle environment. It's maintained by mosquitoes and primates, and it always poses a risk of reintroduction into dense urban centers.
Especially where the Aedes aegypti vector has reinvaded due to poor sanitation. The conditions Ffirth saw in 1804, hot, humid, and stagnant water containers, are still the global ecological prerequisites for a major outbreak today.
And we're left with Ffirth's own philosophical reflection on the nature of human knowledge, written just after he drank the black vomit.
What did he write?
He wrote, "Alas, the nature of man is such that he cannot perceive truth until he has followed error through all the mazy labyrinths of her course. He tries every wrong method ere he discovers the right, and we seldom acquire a new truth except at the expense of an old error."
Ffirth's life demonstrated the full length of that mazy labyrinth, a path of error that, by sheer biological luck, he survived.
And Lazear demonstrated the final expense, the acquisition of the new truth paid for with his own life.
So, considering Ffirth's acceptance of necessary error and Lazear's calculated fatal risk, how should we view the human cost of exploration in modern medical research? If we know that moving from a plausible error to a certain truth often requires this kind of calculated high-stakes human involvement, what is the justifiable price we allow science to exact in its quest to leave the labyrinths of the unknown?
Something to dwell on as you reflect on the difference between knowledge gained through accident and knowledge gained through sacrifice.
And